speech. Please welcome Professor Ian Thomas, and he will be talking about sustainability capabilities, the basis for professional employment. Please also welcome Professor Fang Weida from the Graduate Institute of Environmental Education, National Taiwan Normal University, and also the president of the Asia chapter of the Society of Wetland Scientists.
Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, so our today's lecture, Professor Ian Thomas, and I just read his paper yesterday because we know our education curriculum, we have many projects, but after all, we have a product. Our products, our students, they need to go to outside and find a job. So I think the Ian Thomas do a lot of work on the research. So what is the employment they need? Our students, what is the skill and the attitude and the many professional expertise. Let's introduce Ian Thomas. He came from Australia and is a full-time professor from the School of Global Studies and the Global and Planning and the Social Science in MIT University in Australia. And he had many expertise, especially just focus on environmental impact assessment and environmental education. And he has many titles like a member of Environmental Institute of Australia and New Zealand and Australian Association for Environmental Education. And I think that Ian Thomas came from a very interesting country, Australia. Maybe not so many people visit to Australia, but I know that it's a very beautiful place. So let's welcome Professor Ian Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you for that very warm welcome. And I won't try to explain what the School of Global, etc. means. It's not very important. I think the important thing probably is that we are having the conference today, so we can get on to that. Before I talk about my paper, I'd just like to make 2 or 3 observations. And firstly, to thank you very much for your very warm welcome to us all for today. And I think particularly to thank you very much for being prepared to have this conference in English. It's very hard for us to speak Taiwanese or Mandarin. For you to communicate with us in English is fantastic, so I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. The other, what's that? The other couple of things I'd just like to say is that I find it quite interesting that with the 4 presentations already this morning from the international people and mine, I think you will find that there are many connections that you will see. I'm not going to have the time to draw those connections out, but I think there's a lot of comments which follow on from the things that we've all been saying. And I guess one of the things which struck me also is that if I were to give this presentation in Australia, I would normally be expected to begin my presentation by acknowledging the traditional landowners in Australia, because as you are probably aware, in Australia, the Europeans invaded Australia 200 and more years ago and dispossessed the native Aboriginal people. So it's now common for people starting presentations in public to acknowledge the land ownership and the history of those peoples. But it's also interesting that people usually stop at that point. They don't go on to the next point of acknowledging all the species which have given up their territory and given up their lives in Australia for us as white people to be able to develop the civilisation, the communities, and all the infrastructure which we have. So I think that point about making sure that we're not just talking about human species, but we're also including the other species. And again, we are all part of the world. So again, that's an important element. I think the other thing about reflecting on giving a presentation in Australia is that there would not be many universities in Australia which would host a conference like this. There are many universities who might say they are interested in sustainability, but there are not many who would be prepared to provide the staff, the infrastructure, and things like that to make it work. So that brings me on to another point about good stories. The things that are going well, the things that are changing for the better, as we would see it. So I think one of the big problems we have with our communities generally and our students is that it's very easy to talk about all the problems, all the things that are going wrong. And that has huge implications for us, I feel. And there was a report on our local media just before I left Australia, where they were saying that one reason they felt that there were fewer students applying for environmental or sustainability degrees at university, one of the reasons why there were fewer was that people were feeling that there was no point in doing these sorts of degrees, that it was so depressing to do these degrees. They prefer to go and do business or psychology or whatever. There was more chance for it to be a positive outcome for them. So I think we really need to be talking about those good stories as much as we can and continuing to develop them. And I think Professor Glass's presentation was a great example of those good stories that we have to tell. So perhaps through my presentation, I might also be able to indicate one potentially a good study, a good story for us all. So what I want to talk about is sustainability capabilities, and I'll say what that means in a second or so. Essentially what I want to do is to take you through very quickly the connection between climate change and sustainable development, and particularly the role of education in all of this, and then to start to talk about capabilities. Capabilities in a general sense, but also capabilities for sustainability. And then particularly to give an example of how these are being developed by looking at an Australian survey of the relationship between sustainability, capabilities, but also general capabilities as seen by employers. So as seen by the people who will employ our graduates once they leave our institutions. And then to talk a little bit about how in Australia, how people see universities as being somewhat effective in producing these capabilities. And then just a couple of conclusions. But my starting point is why I'm talking about the association of sustainable development and certain climate change. Because my point is that there are many critical issues that we are talking about that relate to sustainable development. Oops, sorry. So if we look at the broad idea of sustainable development that we've all seen before, we have the concept of sustainable development being that connection between the biophysical environment, society and the economy, and there are many different representations and ideas around that. But if we are looking at that concept, then we start to identify these variety of concerns or issues that we have about loss of biodiversity, about food insecurity, about the problems of eco-justice for communities, water management, particularly in Australia, water management is a big problem with droughts, and climate change. So what I'm saying is that climate change is but one of many big-scale issues that we have to deal with and think about. But climate change is a very good way of talking with people to illustrate a lot of the principles of sustainable development. The next point, in terms of my starting points, is that to reduce those issues that I was just pointing out, we have several ways in which we can work on those issues, several opportunities available to us. And again, if we look at the way in which sustainable development is our centroid, or our goal, if you like, we have these issues that we're trying to work on. And how do we do that? There are a variety of approaches that we have. We can talk about trying to engage with the values of the students and the people we're working with. We can look at their confidence, how well prepared they feel to deal with these sorts of issues. We can look at the resources available, the people, the money, the time, things like that. We can look at the technology that we have and continually to create and develop. But what do we look at most in terms of our concerns, particularly for this audience? Well, our interest in education. Education is a main mechanism that we have to start to work out some of these issues and to work more towards sustainable development. So my context very much is that education has a big role, obviously, to play in the way that we're going to deal with sustainable development and work towards it. If we look at the role of education fairly broadly, clearly education in universities, one of the major focuses of modern education from universities is to create professionals. Get this right here? So to create those professionals who are engineers, doctors, business people, but the people who go out and then begin to involve themselves as professionals and providing the capacities to meet society's needs, particularly through their employment. But to meet those society's needs, professionals don't just come about. They need to be developed. And to do that, those professionals need knowledge and understanding. We know that. But increasingly, we understand that those professionals also need to have the capacity to convert that understanding into action. So one of the key elements that we're looking at, particularly in the way that we think about sustainable development and education related to it, is the education that's going to help people convert those ideas and thinking into action, not just be passive people. So if we start then to look at the understanding that we bring to education through the capabilities, and think about the capabilities of the professionals who are going to go out and operate in the community. Those professionals are going to need information, knowledge, understanding. They're going to have that understanding of sustainable development, what they're aiming for, what they're trying to achieve, and what they're going to do to help us. Not doing well with this, sorry. The information, knowledge and understanding, but also they're going to need those educational experiences, the process that they engage in lectures, in seminars, in experiential education at universities and other ways. But they're also going to need the assessment and testing of these experiences. And that's some of the areas where it's probably hardest for us to engage with at the moment. And I'll start to talk about that in a little bit. But principally, why should we be interested in capabilities in relation to education for sustainable development or education for sustainability? Why are those capabilities the important things that we probably should be starting to focus in on? Well, there are a couple of examples that put it together fairly nicely. 2010 survey of 760 United Nations Global Compact members, CEOs. The overall summary that they said was that CEOs see a critical need for business schools and education systems to focus on developing the next generation of managers and of business leaders with the knowledge, skills, attitudes and behaviour to manage sustainability issues as an integral part of the way that they think about business. So these are the chief executive officers of major organisations around the world are saying that sustainability, understanding, knowledge, skills are critical elements to their future, critical in terms of being able to integrate these concepts into the decision-making processes of the business organisations. The second example comes from Australia. This is a recent report which was released by the Australian government, and essentially the summary was that green skills or skills for sustainability are required for new green jobs and the greening of existing jobs across all industry sectors as a response to climate change and sustainability imperatives. So this is an Australian Government report talking about the future directions for jobs and employment in Australia, identifying sustainability as being a key element. And particularly, I focused in on saying jobs to be greened included just about every discipline area, every professional area that they were dealing with. So again, at a government level, a clear indication that there is a need for understanding and